Okay, we'll start with this per tweet from Michael Benson. The story seems to be Manny Pacquiao versus Errol Spence is reportedly now being explored for July in the USA after the prospect of a Pacquiao versus Terence Crawford fight in the UAE fell through. And I don't know what to make of this news because, as I've stated in many videos, the news in reference to Manny has been immaterial for months. Reports of a Mikey Garcia fight, reports of a Ryan Garcia fight, reports of a Terence Crawford fight, and now reports of an Errol Spence Jr. fight. They've been mixing and matching Manny's name with every guy under the sun, it seems, and none of it seems very tangible. None of it seems very concrete. Even this news, on the heels of the other news.
The Crawford fight is off.
If I'm being honest, this doesn't seem any more tangible and concrete to me than that news was. I won't dismiss it completely, as that would be presumptuous, but I'll say that at this age, 42 years old, and given what Manny's financial demands have been for a Terence Crawford fight, I'm left wondering, is he going to ask for $40 million up front for Errol the way he did for Terence? I don't think Pacquiao people view Errol Spence Jr. in the same light as they viewed Terence Crawford. Not that long ago, it was Manny Pacquiao who was quoted as saying that Errol Spence Jr. is slow. He's too slow.
They're both risky fights for Manny.
A 42-year-old 8th division champion in the twilight of his career who hasn't fought in well over 12 months. It's actually closer to 24 months. It's actually closer to 2 years since Manny had a fight. Either Errol Spence Jr. or Terence Crawford. To both of them, they're both risky fights for Manny. Though I will say, I've never heard Manny Pacquiao talk about Terence Crawford in the context that he talked about Errol Spence Jr. I don't recall Manny ever saying, yeah, Terence, he's too goddamn slow.
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys out there have, but I haven't. And I am left wondering, will Manny Pacquiao ask for $40 million up front for Errol the way he did for Terence? Because if he doesn't, well, that tells you everything you need to know
About what he thinks.
about what Manny thinks of Errol. Hypothetically speaking, if Manny Pacquiao were willing to accept $20 million up front for Errol, half of what he expected up front for Terence, well, that says a lot. I'm just hypothesizing. I'm just bouncing ideas around in the absence of a quote, an actual quote from Mr. Manny Pacquiao himself, the fighting senator. This is in the absence of a quote where he says about Errol what we know he said about Terence. He wants $40 million up front for Terence.
What he said.
Does he want $40 million up front for Errol? I think it would be presumptuous to outright dismiss this news. I'll entertain the possibility that preliminary conversations in reference to the fight are being had, because a lot of things seem to be falling through for Manny Pacquiao. I don't know what happened to that Mikey Garcia fight. That seemed like a fight that was a genuine possibility. That seemed like a very doable fight that both teams were receptive to, and things have slowed when it comes to that conversation. We're hearing this news about an Errol Spence Jr. fight now that things haven't worked out with Terence Crawford. Errol Spence Jr., he's been fighting on Fox his last couple of fights. Fox pay-per-views, but better still, he's been fighting on Fox. And based on reports, the situation between Fox and the PBC is unstable. Industry insiders speculate that Fox won't renew. They're not going to continue into this partnership with the PBC moving forward. We know that Fox hasn't announced a schedule the same way that Showtime announced their schedule. They unveiled their next sequence of fights into the summer months, where Fox has not. That lends credence to the notion that Fox won't be in the PBC business much longer. Fox, where Errol Spence Jr. has been fighting. Errol Spence Jr., who does not have a tentative fight date announced. It's all of it, very immaterial. When news broke that Manny Pacquiao had been demoted from full champion to some other fucking designation by way of the WBA, and Yordenis Ugas was elevated to full champion, Errol Spence Jr. quickly took to social media to let everybody know he wants that fight, he wants to unify with that guy, and up until recently, that's what we thought was going to happen, but in truth, the news in reference to that fight has slowed as of late, hasn't it? Both those guys are on the same side of the street. You have a mutual interest from both parties, both teams, to make the fight happen, and yet nothing official was announced. I don't actually know that they ever went into negotiations. I don't know that this ever went beyond an expressed interest from the fighters themselves. Is it possible that the reason news has slowed in reference to Spence versus Ugas is because that's been put on the back burner for Spence versus Pacquiao? At this point, it's anybody's guess.
That's what this is right now.
It's a guessing game. Two pertinent questions, maybe three pertinent questions stand out. One is, what does Manny Pacquiao want for the Spence fight? Does he want for the Spence fight what he wanted for the Crawford fight? Is he demanding $40 million for Spence the way he was demanding $40 million for Crawford? That's one question. The other question is, on what platform, on what network would the fight go down? Would it go down on Fox? Because the story's supposed to be that Fox is stepping out on the PBC.
Right.
So would it go down on Showtime?
Where does the fight take place?
And the third question, which is more of a follow-up, more of an accessory kind of question.
So Manny's coming back.
If Manny Pacquiao, upon his return, is to face Errol Spence Jr., will the WBA so decide to elevate him from a champion in recess to a full champion like he once was? Is the WBA willing to demote Yordenis Ugas so soon after elevating him to full champion status? We all know that there's more money in Pacquiao versus Spence than there was in Spence versus Ugas. It's a bigger fight. And if they can pull some strings and make some things happen to where that's a unification match, you don't think they would? The WBA has become synonymous with many dubious decisions in this postmodern era of boxing, and I don't put this past them. I mean, don't you guys remember what happened a couple of years ago? Late 2015, when the WBA so decided to strip Guillermo Rigondeaux of his WBA title, awarded it to Scott Quigg ahead of the Carl Frampton fight, so that fight with Carl could be a unification match. You don't remember that? They took Rigo's belt to give it to Scott so that fight could be a unification match. Here in 2021, you don't think they'd do the same thing for Manny Pacquiao and Errol Spence?
I think they would.
I think that's a genuine possibility, but it's a genuine possibility that is contingent on this news checking out and that fight happening. In order for this sequence of events to take place, the Pacquiao versus Spence story, it's got to check out.
The fight's got to happen.
And I don't know if it will. I don't know if it won't. Manny's name has been attached to a lot of people the last 12 months. It's been attached to Mikey. It's been attached to Ryan. It's been attached to Terrence. It's been attached to Errol. It's even been attached to Conroy McGregor.
Before Conroy got his ass kicked.
We've mulled over all those particulars. There still are the perspectives of a fight fan to also be addressed. I'm not that interested in seeing 42-year-old Manny Pacquiao, almost 2 years removed from the sport, locking horns with either Terrence Crawford or Errol Spence Jr. And I won't kid you, there's money in those fights. Those could all be lucrative endeavors for any one of those two welterweight champions. They very well could be. It's Manny Pacquiao we're talking about. It's a big Pacquiao fight. I'm not telling you there's no money in those fights. There is. I'm telling you that from where I'm sitting, the proposition of a 42-year-old Manny Pacquiao fighting either Terrence Crawford or Errol Spence Jr., it's not that appealing to me. It's not that intriguing. We know that Manny's on the back nine. He's at the tail end of his career. That's where he is. And whatever he does against those two guys can only be described as cashing out. Passing to the torch fight. I'm not actually all that interested in Pacquiao versus Crawford or Pacquiao versus Spence.
I think it's ridiculous they're still chasing this old guy around.
And this ain't situational. I've been saying this for the last, 2-3 years. I'm sick of seeing these young guys use the name of Manny Pacquiao to avoid facing each other. And that directly pertains to Errol Spence Jr. and Terrence Crawford. I've never been all that interested in Crawford versus Pacquiao or Spence versus Pacquiao. I'm not actually confident that this fight is going to materialize. It wouldn't surprise me if it did. Wouldn't surprise me if it didn't. I just know that I'm not all that excited about it, and I never was.
A pay-per-view attraction. And I am conservative about that. I think that they need more exposure on free television to really build them up as a pay-per-view attraction. But they think otherwise. And since it's his career, and the father has said he only wants to be in pay-per-view fights. So sink or swim, we're going to put him in pay-per-view fights. I just think it's a little premature.
Are you so you'll be rooting for him to win on Triller, or you just don't, or you have no opinion on it?
Oh, I'm rooting for him to win. He's my fighter. Why wouldn't I root for him to win? And he's going to win, easy, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But again, after this fight, his contract continues with Toprank for another 3+ years.
That soundbite was sent to me via one of the subscribers here on the channel in reference to an interview conducted by Barbershop Conversations with Bob Arum, who seems to be indicating that they're going to give Teofimo what he wants. They're going to put him on pay-per-view henceforth, provided he's successful against George Kambosos Jr. on Triller. Once that excursion is over and done with, Teofimo will be returning to Top Rank, and he'll be a pay-per-view guy henceforth. Sink or swim, as Bob Arum so adequately put it. This could be a sign that the relationship between Teofimo, the Lopez people, and Top Rank, this could be a sign that their relationship is on the mend, though now, unlike before, there's an added bit of pressure for this pay-per-view to deliver, for this pay-per-view to perform. There are things that were said that I agree with, and things that were done that I don't agree with. I did agree with Bob Arum that this is not a big fight. It's not pay-per-view worthy. This is your run-of-the-mill mandated title defense. George Kambosos Jr. doesn't have a very big name in the United States, and Teofimo Lopez, he's really just building upon his. He does have a name, though I don't know that it's warranted to build this as a pay-per-view. Nevertheless, I agreed with what Bob Arum said. I just didn't agree with what the people at Top Rank did. I don't think they should have tried to collude with the people over there at Matchroom to prevent them from bidding on the fight in order to put a cap on what the fight is worth.
It was highly unethical.
Until this point, I thought Teofimo Lopez was leaving Top Rank. But based on this soundbite from Bob Arum, he might be staying. And if he is staying, and he is going to be participating in pay-per-view fights henceforth, even after this one is over, then there is some pressure for this thing to deliver, for this thing to perform. I told you before, just because the people over there at Triller were willing to stake $6 million of their own money to host this fight, that doesn't put the actual value of the fight at $6 million. We don't know what the value of the fight is until people actually pay for it. Then we'll know what the fight is worth and what it ain't worth.
It's got to at least break even.
It's not going to be an encouraging omen if the people over there at Triller put up $6 million to stage this thing, and it don't bring you back $6 million, then how's that reflect on Teofimo Lopez's contention that he deserves to be on pay-per-view? Deserves to be there to do what? Lose people money?
It's got to deliver now.
It has to perform. This is not a business that's run on ideals and principle. This is a business that's run by finance, run by money. Money and making it is the bottom line. And if you think you belong on pay-per-view, well, now you're going to have to prove it. One very encouraging omen, at least for me, that might actually have me pulling out my wallet, is that the French-owned Cruz versus Eline Cedar-Ruz undisputed super middleweight title fight is set to go down on the undercard of Lopez versus Kambosos Jr. And I don't know about you guys. I don't speak for you. I only speak for me. But for me, that would go a long way towards making the card attractive, because Lopez versus Kambosos as a main event might not even be competitive, whereas Cruz Dezern versus Cedar-Ruz, I'll pay to see that, because that promises to be a fight for however long it lasts. It's for the undisputed super middleweight championship. And as far as I'm concerned, that's worth the money. That's actually more of a selling point for me than Lopez versus Kambosos Jr. That's your run-of-the-mill title defense is what that is.
Decorating this card is pivotal.
If I'm being honest, I wasn't even sure if I was going to buy this thing up until that news broke, that the wheels are in motion to make Dezern versus Cedar-Ruz happen on the undercard of this fight. Before that, I wasn't sure if I was going to put my money up to see this thing.
So there still is hope.
That maybe the card will deliver. It will bring back good pay-per-view numbers, though I reiterate, I don't know that it'll be because of Lopez versus Kambosos. That's not a big fight. And finally, Showtime Stefan Espinoza weighed in on the date, venue for Floyd Mayweather versus Logan Paul, and how it's not determined. Stefan was quoted as saying, in terms of the specifics, it's premature. You know, there were reports out, one of which sort of pegged the date as June 5th. It's definitely not June 5th. It never has been. There are a few dates that we're sort of circling and a few venues. You know, Floyd put up a poll on Instagram earlier a few days ago about different sites, and that's really where we are. I do expect some definitive definitive resolution within, I don't know, the next few days, the next week roughly, but there really isn't. Not trying to be coy, it hasn't been determined. Date, venue, etc. I think the most alarming portion of this article is where Stephen Espinoza says, I think the bigger question has been, is it going to happen? Espinoza said. Is the event going to happen, and in what state? There was never really a question, I think, from our perspective about being involved. I think we've had a long and successful relationship with Floyd. This one is a little bit different from the other ones, but, we want to remain in the business with him, and he's comfortable with us. So, we're riding with Floyd. If this is where he's going, then we're going to be along with him. We're good partners. I mean, essentially, Stephen is asserting that they have a commitment to being involved with things that Floyd is doing whenever Floyd is comfortable with them being involved. In that way, he's confirming what Mike Kopinger tweeted about earlier this week, that Showtime's in bed with Floyd for this fight. They weren't in bed with him for that Tenshin Nuxu Cow fight, but they are in bed with him for this. So in that way, this is confirmation that now Showtime's involved. Though Stephen Espinoza, in so many words, left a big shadow of doubt as to whether or not the fight will happen at all. And that goes back to what I was telling you guys, that even with Showtime involved, this is a tough sell. This ain't for the boxing fans. This has to be for the youth culture, social media culture, and people that hit like and subscribe on Logan Paul videos. This has to be for them. And those folks, I'm not sure how many of those folks are subscribed to Showtime.
I mean, this one is pretty out there.
Even as far as exhibition matches go, Uber celebs and influencers, this one is pretty out there. Even in that scope, even in that realm, more people were interested in seeing Ben Askren versus Jake Paul than people are interested in seeing Floyd Mayweather Jr. versus Logan Paul.
This one's just fucking frivolous.
And I won't get into the purest sentiments that maybe Floyd might be hurting his legacy by doing something like this. I don't think we got to get into that. I think what we got to get into is who the fuck wants to see this, regardless of the purists? Who the fuck wants to spend their hard-earned money to watch Floyd waltz with a YouTuber in an exhibition match that has no outcome?
What's the selling point for a fight like that?
Who out there is this supposed to appeal to?